I thought it might be fun to try and go back in time and try and remember all the different modalities that I've studied and all the kind of healing work I've done that I draw on in my life now when I come to the table to support other people. I remember being a curious 16-year-old and having these lengthy discussions about the meaning of life and my purpose. And recently a friend was clearing out stuff and she had this book by Shakti Gawain called Creative Visualization, and that just took me back in time to the bookshop in Cooma where I bought it as a young woman. And around that time, I also got super interested in all the different religions, and I started reading really broadly around like Taoism, Buddhism, shamanism, pagan religions, Rastafarianism, Sufism, and like I think I may have also read about like the Kabbalah. Anyway, I read about so many different religions, and I got really curious about yoga, and I kept asking my mum, like, what's yoga? And she would always just say, look, it's one of those things you just have to do it to understand what it is. And I remember walking up to this guy in Cooma who was a yoga teacher and just being like, hey, what's yoga? And he said the same thing. He said, yeah, you have to just come and do yoga and then you understand what it was. And then I started Satchitananda yoga from when I was like 16 for about 28 years in a pretty dedicated way. I had a couple little breaks. But those like asana and shatkarmas and pranayama all just helped me really get in touch with my body. I just wasn't really aware of my body. And there was one practice, Yoga Nidra, that I had actually done once before in year 5 on a school camp. And one of the camp leaders like gave us all Yoga Nidra but didn't really tell us. She didn't say like, guys, this is Yoga Nidra. She just talked us through it. And I just remember having such a blissful experience doing Yoga Nidra. So when I found it again, it just felt really sweet. Next, I reckon, was probably like when I was around 18 and I was working in the ski fields in Jindabyne. And I was living in Jindabyne, working in the ski fields, and there was this new age shop, but I didn't know what that was. There was just this shop with like all this cool stuff in it that I'd never really seen before, and all these amazing books and crystals and essential oils, and I just loved it. I'd go in there all the time and spend all my pay in there. And I remember getting my first essential oil kit that was like orange, lang lang and lavender, and it had a little diffuser, and I also started buying crystals, and that was the beginning of a mega love for all of those for me. I mean, that shop just opened up a whole portal. And I also used to drive from like Cooma down to Bega and go to the Whole Foods shop, and then I'd drive up to Tilba and go to Gulaga Gallery. And Gulaga Gallery also has an epic crystal stash and bookstore, and just such a beautiful store full of healing things. And between those two, if you've ever been, you'll totally understand why I fell really in love with those things. And I think it's important to say that, like, as well as loving all of those things, there was always part of me that just like sat away from them, like with a bit of cynicism and doubt. And I think it's really healthy to have that, a bit of discernment about everything, really. I think it's pretty healthy. I try to encourage my kids to, stay discerning. I reckon next was menstrual tracking and using reusable menstrual pads. Like, that really put me in touch with my cycle. It was really earthy and I was really up for that. I really got heaps out of that. But at that time, I guess I still wasn't really super in love with my body. I just still had so much shame and like low self-worth and stuff about my body. So it was good, but I think like for me, the last couple of years, I've started cycle tracking again, and that's been really helpful. It's really got me back in touch with it in a way where I can tap into the gifts a lot more. And part of that has been around looking at like tracking in a circle. Let me know if you want that tracker. I have it as a PDF, and I track in a circle so that I can actually think about my cycle in terms of seasons. That has been really big for me. Next, I reckon Vipassana meditation practice came into my life, even though I didn't actually go and sit a course around then. I was around 22. That was sort of when the seed was planted for me. And I'd say at that time, I was traveling India and different stuff. And I reckon that was my anti-spiritual phase, because when I started doing yoga, then I ended up living in a yoga community, and I sort of I just had some things happen. I was like, if that's spiritual, I don't even want to be spiritual. Like, that's not cool, man. So I was in my non-spiritual phase, and then when I got back from India, I got pregnant, and the whole story about my first baby who died, Josh, is available. The link is just a bit further down. If you go to the website on the blog post, all the links are there. But I talk through my whole experience with my first baby in a podcast with Tracy Swainson, and it was actually such a beautiful experience. Like, going through all the grief process was just really potent for me, and even though I wasn't looking for anything spiritual in my life, when I was in Bundaberg, actually, after my baby died, there was a New Age shop there, and I can't remember what I bought there, but it put me back in touch with my, like, New Age stuff and my spiritual path. So even though I wasn't looking for spirituality, like, life just had other plans for me. And I think grief is really important. I think it's something a lot of people are scared of, or some people say, like, oh, we're not really very good at grief. But I have another podcast all about how I think we actually are quite good at grief, and you'll find that in the podcast, or there's a link in the blog. And it was when I was in that postnatal time after Josh had died. I was staying at this permaculture farm in Bundaberg, and that really ignited my love for permaculture. And I know it's not strictly a healing modality, but I do think it's so beautiful, and really, it's been a really important tool for me to help me have a framework for, like, how I interact with my living space and how I interact with my community and how I show up in the world at large. And then after Josh died, after a little while, I separated from his dad. And then I was so lost. I was just, like, so sad and so lost. And I had this kind of funny breathing thing that I couldn't figure out. It was like, it's like I just couldn't get enough breath. And, like, now I realize that it was like panic attacks and anxiety. But at the time I didn't really know. And I went to this acupuncturist, and that's where I first ever had acupuncture. And that just another lifelong love is having acupuncture. It just always seems to sort me out when other people, other things might not. I also got a book from the library. It must have been a library book or something about macrobiotic cooking, and I was mucking around with that. And through the yoga community that I'd been living with, I'd learned a lot of whole food cooking. I loved the Paul Pitchford book, Healing with Whole Foods, and my acupuncturist recommended that I go to Vipassana, and I signed up again and didn't go again, but obviously it was still brewing. Instead of going to Vipassana, I ended up living in a yoga community again with a bunch of other women, and our primary focus was on supporting women and mothers with yoga. And during that time I got pregnant. I consciously conceived, and I free birthed a baby, my beautiful first living baby, Divyatma. She's 23 now. Crazy how time flies. And I think free birthing is another really cool wormhole, and really just gave me so much, like, really just, yeah, it's a really good thing. Like, I loved getting educated about my body and its capacity, and, how radical it is actually, like, to try and birth at home. Like, so yeah, I free birthed all my babies, and, like, obviously if I'd needed to, I would have gone to hospital if anything came up. And I do respect the medical system, but I think there is a bit of an issue lately with, like, women not actually believing in their innate capacity to birth children, which is a whole other rant. But I think, the free birth or home birth or just birthing wormhole is a good one to go down, and I got heaps out of it. I feel like I really got transmissions from, like, the spiritual midwifery books. I think is it Ina May Gaskin, and books from Janine Parvati Baker that I got a real transmission from. So yeah, I mean, having kids, being a mother, it's massive. It's just been really freaking intense, and I've grown so much as a person through that. I think at some stage when I left the yoga community, I understood that, like, my family life was going to be my spiritual teaching, and hell yeah, it has. It's been really challenging and really beautiful, really full on. I just got to drink some water. Also, while I was living in the yoga community, we went to Confest. And I mean, if you haven't been to Confest, I really recommend it. It's just one of my peak life experiences. There's heaps of like nudity, and there's this pop-up blackboard workshop thing. And there's just workshops. There's like little tarps all over the place in the bush. And you go there and there's like some guy in the nick talking about UFOs. Or you go to another tarp and there's like tantra massage, or there's just like so much weird stuff going on, but also really cool stuff. I love the Sweat Lodge. I love Confest. And around that time, we also started running a local women's camp. That was 23 years ago. Actually, this spring, like September equinox, I went and I was there with a bunch of the women who were at the first ever one, which is unbelievable to me. But really, women's camp and women's circle, and just that style of communication that's really genuine, authentic, unfiltered, I'm not being judged. It's pretty hard for me to go back from that and to slot into normal society again. So yeah, I mean, it's pretty rough if you're just a member of normal society and you try and interact with me, because I'm kind of at women's camp all the time. It also can really trigger me, women's camp. And I think there's another podcast, or maybe it was a blog post about women's camp and just the magic of women's camp, and also how challenging it can be. There's definitely a blog. I don't know if there's a podcast. No podcast, but yes, blog. So yeah, I mean, that it's all the sister wound stuff and all the like memories from being at school, and there's like cool girls and I felt not cool, and all my self-worth stuff and all that kind of stuff, just really, really intense. So now I'm a bit older and I've got some really good structures to work with my stuff when it comes up. It's much less harrowing. Plus, I think I was going to women's camp when I had tiny, tiny babies. Like the first one, my daughter was literally 6 weeks old, which is a bit crazy. But you know, any wonder I was finding it hard. Like I was friggin' mothering a tiny baby. In 2015, I started my business, and I really didn't mean to start a business. I had just got a Bachelor of Commerce with majors in marketing. I thought it was going to get me a really nice, well-paid job. And I ended up finding an online community of business women, and who was there? Like all my witches, right? Healers, coaches, hypnotists, naturopaths, kinesiologists, and all the other witches, like hanging out, supporting each other. It was a really fun time, and I did a bunch of different healing modalities then, which I hadn't even heard of before, and I cannot remember all the names of them. There was like intuitive healing, hypnosis, archangel channeling. I just can't remember them all. It's too many. And I've done a bunch of local bodywork stuff in the Bega Valley, because I was experiencing lots of physical pain and all these weird ailments and stuff I didn't really understand then, but I'm hypermobile. So at that time I saw acupuncturists, chiropractors, traditional Chinese medicine healers, homeopaths, naturopaths. Like I love all those modalities, and I really got heaps out of all of those. And I think, you know, you kind of, like whenever I try a new modality, I try and read a book about it or learn a bit about it. And I think, you know, I've kind of like integrated a lot of that understanding and that approach. In the last sort of 5-10 years, I studied Australian bushflower essences, which I love. I've got the full stock kit, and so I can dispense, and I've done sessions. I've really loved learning that. And I do have a passion for herbalism, but I'm not really all that educated. I just have like a hobbyist kind of understanding about it. But I love, you know, having heaps of plants in my garden. My garden's a place of much love and tension, but I now can kind of graze my garden and pick some leaves and then make a fancy tea. I love that. This year I'm doing the Earth Women course through the School of Shamanic Womancraft. I'm doing it with a mentor on Zoom, and I decided to interact with that School of Shamanic Womancraft because it seemed to me that like a lot of their teachings brought together a heap of disparate learnings that I've been working with. And like, you know, say 20 whatever years ago, 30 years ago, I didn't have the money to do a course like that. Like I would have loved to do naturopathy and herbalism when I was 16, 17, but I just like didn't have the money because it was a really expensive course. So this year I was like, stuff it. Like these guys really are where I'm at, like the shamanic stuff, and it just brought everything together. So I just took the leap, and I also thought, well, look, I'm doing women's circles and I'm doing these camps, and I want to feel really equipped and supported in myself so that I can really hold space for others. And I really just thought, look, I've done so much healing work. There's not really going to be much for me to do. I'll just do this course. It'll just be so la-di-da. Ha ha ha. It's been mega. It's been really great. I've been through the spring and summer, and I'm currently working in the autumn module. It's been so beautiful. I love the work so much. I'll talk more about that in other podcasts and blog posts. I also have done a bunch of like Western medicine approaches to healing my body and my well-being. Like I had an operation on a deviated septum, which I had tried so many yogic things to try to manage, but I had a deviated septum, so just had to sort that out. And like a couple of years ago, I ended up in hospital, had a couple of little blood transfusions after a really long period, and that is also a story for another day. I've also done counselling. I've had psychology, therapy sessions, and I'm also a bit of a self-help nut. Like, I've read all the books, guys. You know how it is in Audible. I've got all the books in there and just a few on my shelf that are beside me, say like Forest Bathing, Nonviolent Communication, The Artist's Way, which reminds me that, for the last however many years I've been doing a lot of like art therapy and also learning lots of different art and craft modalities, as well as like I'm a knitter and a sewer. So I think, all of those hands-on approaches are really sweet ways to heal and soothe things inside me that words and thinking and analysis can't really touch. And I'm sure I've missed a bunch of modalities. Like I forgot to mention that I actually did get to Vipassana in the end, and I've been sitting pretty regularly since 2007, but I've recently had a bit of a break because I'm focusing more on shamanic work and on land and nature-based practices, and I'm not really sure if they'll let me back while I do these things because they have some pretty strict rules for returning students, which often excludes shamanic practice and people who have done other kinds of meditations, because lately I've just been loving the Joe Dispenza meditations, like the tuning into new potentials with the breath work. Oof, love that. Just remembered a few that I'd forgotten to mention, like hypnosis, oracle decks, Akashic records, human design, astrology, knitting and craft, being a mother, just being alive and being highly sensitive, learning to be gluten-free and low carb after being a lacto-ovo-vegetarian's whole food cook from the age of 18, as well as being a massive junk food addict, learning to live with body dysmorphia, self-identifying as ADHD, and I'm currently doing a graduate diploma in writing and literature with Deakin University, which turns out has a really delicious amount of focus on being a creative person. And I'd say, like, just to wrap it all up for where I'm at right now is like one of my core focuses, I have a few, but one of them I'd say is to try to remember to bring the magic into my life. Like when I bring in the magic, then my life is way more magical. And by magic, I just mean like singing, drumming, doing art, being in nature, being slow, being with women, just sticking to my guns, believing in myself, honoring my intuition, loving myself. And the more I do that, just the better my life is. I think that's enough for today. I'm sure I'll come back and add more stuff as I remember, but just like that's kind of vaguely it. Mwah. Thanks for listening. Bye.